All right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are coming in from today. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I am the Managing Director here at PON. And for nearly 40 years now, the Program on Negotiation has led the world in research, curriculum development, and executive education trainings related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we've also expanded since the pandemic to a series of live virtual events in what we're thinking of as our online classroom. Welcome back to so many of you who are coming again to PON Live, and please continue to let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. We do love to see you from really all over the world. And for today's event, we have the great pleasure of welcoming an invited guest, Sreedhari Desai, a professor of organizational behavior and the Chris W. Blackwell Scholar at the University of North Carolina's Kenan-Flagler Business School. Sreedhari is a researcher, speaker, facilitator, and an advisor to numerous organizations, both public and private. And like a couple of other invited guests that we've had this semester, we're very proud to say she's also a PON alum as a former graduate research fellow who has gone on to do amazing things. Her discussion today, Heels at Work, will center on the intersection of symbols of professionalism and femininity. And we're joined today by a distinguished and VIP moderator for our discussion, our colleague and friend, Max Bazerman, professor of business administration at Harvard Business School and a PON executive committee member. We will be bringing Max back, I think, just one more time this semester, although it's hard to imagine doing these events without him, for a talk on his newest work, which will be released in April, Decision Leadership, co-authored with Don Moore of Berkeley. So Sreedhari and Max will be speaking for 40 minutes or so, and there will be time during the session for questions at the conclusion. So please, of course, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter in your questions at any time. That allows other participants to see your questions and also to upvote in case they have the same one. And of course, please use the comments in the chat if you have a comment at any time. We will be recording this session and it will be posted on the PON website in about a week to 10 days once the captioning has been finalized. Before I pass off to our speakers, a special thanks to our PON staff as ever, who are so great in preparing this event. Diane Long, events coordinator, James Kerwin, and for the first time, Billy Fairfield, our newest PON staff member who will be supporting us on events. Thank you three for all of your work in getting us here today. And now, Sreedhari and Max, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to all the PON staff for making these events occur. It's a delight and so thrilling to see the global nature of the audience that's saying hello to us in the chat. I'll simply repeat what Nicole said. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A, not in the chat, because that's where I'm going to be looking for the questions. And also feel free to upvote so that I get good coaching on what questions you most want to hear Sreedhari respond to. With that, I'll primarily just add my welcome to Sreedhari Desai, who was educated at the University of Utah, grew up in India, was a visiting faculty member at Duke's Fuqua School, but is a professor and Blackwell Scholar at the University of North Carolina. But most importantly, from our perspective, she spent multiple years with us at Harvard at the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics, at the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and as a PON graduate research fellow from 2009 to 2010. So it's terrific to have you back, Sreedhari, and we're delighted to hear you tell us about Heels at Work. And I already hear that there's interest in people wondering whether you have heels on. So hopefully we'll find out somewhere along the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max. Thank you for the super warm welcome. And it's such an honor and a privilege to be talking to all you wonderful people attending from all parts of the world. Today, I'm going to present to you some of my work on Heels at Work, whether or not symbols of professionalism imbued with femininity can in fact offer women a leg up, or if they create an unequal footing for women in the workplace. I want to start by saying that this is one of those projects of mine which I have picked up and then put down multiple times, chiefly because I've had academic colleagues tell me not to study frivolous things such as what women wear to work, and instead focus my attention on heftier topics like ethics in the workplace. But call it escalation to commitment or call it just pure passion, I've never been able to let go of this topic. And so many years later, I'm super happy to be able to share it with such a lovely audience as all of you. So I want to start by observing that back in 2016, you may have heard of the Nicola Thorpe case. Nicola, who was a temporary employee at PricewaterhouseCoopers in their London office, showed up to work one day wearing her flat footwear. And upper management basically told her that no, she would have to switch over to heels, 2 to 4 inch heels specifically, in order to comply with the official dress code policy for female employees in the workplace. Nicola asked, well, can I not do my job well enough in flat footwear? What do heels have to do with my success as a professional? Got no answers. And then, because she refused to oblige, she was fired. And like any true-blooded millennial, she went ahead and took to Twitter and tweeted out her angst about being forced to wear heels in the workplace. Nicola's tweet ended up raising a storm, an international debate, if you will, the world over, with people complaining about wearing heels and having to suffer through them for 8 hours. Others saying, no, heels make me look tall, make me feel empowered. And so why are we having this debate even, right? Now, it turns out that Nicola Thorpe's case was not isolated. In fact, a year ago in Israel, female flight attendants had protested against the Israeli airline El Al's new policy requiring women to not only wear high heels. So these are stewardesses being asked to wear high heels, not only in airports, but also when they climb aboard the plane and are helping passengers put their heavy luggage up in the bins, etc. Not just Israel, in Japan as well. There was the Kutu movement that was started when one female employee felt that it was unfair to require heels in the workplace in official dress code policies. So Kutu, which is in fact a bit of a pun on kutsu, and kutsu, which means heels and also pain, is a movement that has been a bit of a fledgling movement, but is picking up and gaining momentum in the last years. Likewise, in Ukraine, guess what? The female soldiers were asked to parade wearing high heels. And in fact, when there was a lot of international scathing of the Ukrainian government's policy requiring women to wear heels, the Department of Defense in Ukraine said that this was not unusual. It was part of the cultural norm. So we are not going to change it, right? Coming back to Nicola Thorpe's story, she tried to get lots of signatures to try and change the law, but was unsuccessful in changing the law altogether. And in fact, in the UK, there exist certain companies that have personal appearance policies dictating that a woman should wear heels, and the heel height normally should be minimum of 2 inches, maximum of 4 inches, and that female employees and managers should in fact sign to acknowledge that they understand that any breach of this particular policy will be regarded as misconduct and that disciplinary action may be taken. Coming home here to the US, which is where I am at present, both the courts and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have held that an employer may establish different dress codes for men and women with the goal of creating a professional atmosphere as long as they are based on prevalent social norms and do not put a greater burden on either gender, right? Now, not just the courts and the EEOC, which say that if you don't follow the policy, you might actually be open to being fired by the organization, you're basically making yourself vulnerable. Turns out that informal norms and expectations in both the US and Canada center around requiring women to wear closed-toe footwear in neutral colors like beige, blue, navy blue, that is, black, and so forth. and that you should on average wear 2 to 4 inch heels. In particular, I want to highlight a case at Goldman Sachs, where a former Goldman Sachs employee said that the financial firm's culture promoted the belief that women had a professional responsibility to wear heels, and the higher, the better. Okay. Not just Goldman Sachs, but in general, if you pick any dress for success kind of self-help book, if you read any blog posts on how to ace interviews, if you happen to be a woman, oftentimes they recommend that you should wear heels that are 2 to 4 inches tall, right? And of course, the media does its bit as well. When you see images of Sheryl Sandberg or Marissa Myers and others wearing heels on the front page of business papers, newspapers, and journals, then it reinforces the messaging that in order to be successful, in order to climb the corporate ladder, you ought to wear heels. So why should we care, right? Well, this is a response really to my academic colleagues who might be watching this eventually. Widespread expectations that female employees should adhere to symbolic gender norms, including those as seemingly trivial as the height of the heel of their shoes, may be consequential in ways that are not well understood, right? And more formally, gendered organizational practices, such as requiring women or expecting them formally or informally to wear heels and observe certain dress codes, can in fact be a bit of a keyhole issue through which we can examine the broader issue of how gender inequality is created or recreated and maintained over time in organizations. So, shining the spotlight a little bit on heels, I think it'll be helpful for us to understand how did heels originate, how have they evolved over time. So guess what? Heels were originally designed for functional reasons for men, okay? In fact, Persian cavalrymen ended up requesting that slight heels be built into their shoes so that their feet could stay stable in the stirrups and not come off when they were mounting a horse. Now, when the European aristocracy saw these Persian cavalrymen with their fancy shoes, or what they perceived to be fancy shoes, they also wanted some. So here we have images of European and especially French aristocracy donning heels, and with male aristocrats wearing heels, women aristocrats also started to wear heels because they thought that anytime they would venture out into the streets, remember back in the day, these were unpaved, dirty, filth. Well, the heels would protect the hemline of their gowns from the filth on the roads, right? And so once the aristocracy started wearing heels and they mandated that you couldn't wear heels unless you were an aristocrat, a born aristocrat, that is, the general population started to associate status and power with heels, right? And so eventually what ended up happening was everybody wanted to sort of get access to these symbols of power. Now, as it turns out, when the camera was invented, photographers started posing women in heels, and some of these photographs were rather pornographic in nature. At other times, they were touched up subsequently, like artists, the old-fashioned touched up. And so heels started to be associated with femininity somewhat. And in fact, in the post-World War era, when household appliances started to be mass marketed to the general population, oftentimes you would see a female model posing as a demure housewife, quite domesticated, wearing her heels. And this image on the right is one of the nicer pictures I could find. A lot of them are really horrible. Now, with the 60s and the anti-establishment culture that was prevalent back then, heels started to sort of fade away a little bit. But then, once again, in the late 70s, with the faucet culture, we ended up having heels make a comeback. The 80s, on the other hand, saw women trying to mimic men a little bit, wearing shoulder pads, selecting loafers instead of heels. But with the advent of the 1990s and then the 2000s, a philosophy arose that the trappings of stereotyped femininity should be transformed into signifiers of professional success. In other words, the feminists said, Why do we want to ape the men? We have our own unique stamp. Heels symbolize femininity. We need to make our presence felt in the workplace while at the same time maintaining our femininity. Okay. And of course, in more recent times, we see that high power women's networks are sometimes even named after a certain kind of heels, stiletto networks, for example. And in Japan, you can pay 4,000 US dollars, that's like 400,000 yen, I believe, to sign up into a 6-month course on how to not waddle, but walk elegantly in stilettos and be a power dresser. So there is, in fact, a lot of self-help again, and then a lot of movement suggesting that heels should be donned if you want to climb up the corporate ladder. And not just the upper echelons of organizations, but we did a quick study, and I say we because I did this initially with my friend Chia Jung Sai, where we looked at whether or not ordinary women care about heels. And so we went ahead and polled women on MTurk, and we learned that on average, women have 11 pairs of heels, and that oftentimes they wear heels because they want to appear professional, they want to exude confidence, and they want to appear to be powerful. So the heels, the prevalence of heels is not just one dimension, one aspect of society, one culture, or one strata of society, but it's very, very prevalent. And importantly, I wanted to know, well, do they help or do they not help? Does wearing heels help us women to go up in corporations, or does it actually hinder our ability to climb the ladder? So there are many arguments for heels and a few arguments against heels. The first one being height advantage. There's research by Dan Cable and Timothy Judge that shows that the taller you are, the more competent you're perceived, the larger the salary premium that you're able to command. So wearing heels makes you taller, right? There's also notions of power dressing, and there are theories like status power transfer theory, which suggest that if you end up wearing heels, then heels are a symbol of power and higher status, and some of that rubs off on you. And as a consequence, people think you're powerful, and so they'll treat you better. They'll think you are a leader. It helps you to look more professional to the extent that that particular industry requires heels to be professional. And the more professional you are, the better the odds of getting promoted. And some people even argue that wearing heels can make you sexually more attractive and influential. In fact, there was a study done where they put point lights on a woman and made her walk either in flat footwear or in heels. And they found that when she walked in heels, her butt would stick out and her other secondary sexual features would get enhanced, making her look more attractive, especially to a male audience. And there's work by Marla Baskerville and others that shows that women sometimes do use sex as a tool in the workplace to get ahead. So maybe wearing heels can help in that way. However, there are also several theories that suggest that wearing heels might actually backfire. Prominent among them is social role theory, which suggests that if you end up adhering to societal norms and wear heels, you might be perceived as being very warm and feminine. And typically people have a think leader, think male kind of a mindset, and therefore you'll be disadvantaged in the workplace. There are also others who suggest that because your secondary sexual features get enhanced when you wear heels, you might be perceived as an object. You might be objectified. You might not be viewed as an individual with thoughts, intelligence, and feelings, rather as an object to be toyed with, to be played with, and then put aside. Yet others also suggest that by wearing heels, you're sort of conforming to the expectation, especially here in the US, that that is appropriate office work, and that by actually wearing flats, you are breaking that norm. And work by Francesca Gino and others shows that when you disconform to some of these norms, people perceive that you are actually more powerful, and that's why you're able to do it and get away with it. So I essentially set up a bunch of competing hypotheses, both for wearing heels, as in how it might advantage us, women, or also against how it might disadvantage us, okay? And what I'm going to do now is to share with you some studies that I conducted to examine whether or not heels seem to benefit women in the workplace, or if in fact heels which women claim to be wearing in order to improve their odds of success in the workplace might in fact be holding them back. So the first study that I did was by examining TED Talks, scientific TED Talks. And in particular, I was focusing on female presenters in the domain of science and technology. And my intention was to observe whether or not women presenters who are wearing heels, like the one here, or wearing flats, like the one over here, can in fact benefit in terms of getting more or fewer likes to total views per talk. Okay, so I looked at 392 videos, and at this point I need to pause and say a big thank you to my awesome husband, Roman Shcherbakov, who helped me with this particular study. He helped me to gather metadata for these videos that he was able to collect for me from YouTube APIs. So things like duration of the video, the time elapsed since the video was uploaded, whether the presenters wore heels or not. And since some of you are wondering, this is what I'm wearing today, no heels, okay? And out of these 392 videos, 383 had footwear visible. And in addition, I had an army of RAs. I am deeply, deeply indebted to all my wonderful RAs, especially, Manya Mehra, Arnav, Dylan, and others, who helped me to then code the data. So we looked at the age of the presenter, her height, her race, university affiliation, whether or not she had a foreign accent, the color of her hair, the length of her hair, facial attractiveness, her fitness levels, whether or not she was wearing glasses, makeup, accessories, whether it was a revealing attire or not. And also we coded for presenters' communication styles, such as the use of hand gestures, figurative speech, storytelling. We also coded for a subset of these videos using some software, their facial emotions. And we looked at their use of pronouns, whether they were using verbs or adjectives, whether their talk was focused on the present, the past, or the future. So basically, a whole set of controls were used in this particular study. And I'm going to spare you from suffering through the analytical strategy. But if you're curious, reach out to me. Okay, and what we found in this particular study was, number one, being attractive, having a foreign accent, and being tall led to more likes. Okay, and more importantly, symbols of femininity, in other words, heels, resulted in fewer likes in both of our probit and logit models. So basically what this study told me was that even highly educated women, highly educated, highly successful professional women are not free from the heel effect. Now this study is fine, but using archival data, you cannot really rule out every possible confound, and there is control that is really missing. So I designed what I thought would be a somewhat tighter study, this time an experiment. And I had 221 undergraduate students take part in a study where they would come to the lab, they would look at a camera, assuming that the camera was taking a picture of them, and then they were told that they would be paired with another participant and get to see their picture, interact with them a bit, and then negotiate with them. Okay, the thinking here was that if women are wearing heels, they may be stereotyped as passive, warm, cooperative, or objects without autonomy, which might hurt them in a negotiation setting. On the other hand, if women are wearing flats, they may be viewed as counter-stereotypical and therefore as dominant, assertive, and somewhat competitive. And maybe because of the mismatching that often happens in negotiations, where you're more likely to cave in if you think the other side is dominant, and more likely to be aggressive if you think the other side is kind of weak and cooperative. In this distributive bargaining exercise that we used, we expected to see some effects of wearing heels versus flats, okay? And I want to point out right away that all of the participants were put in the role of the seller, and the buyer was in fact a computer software that was chatting with the sellers, right? The buyer in this scenario apparently was a business person who owned an upscale exotic handicraft store at one of the city's biggest malls. And the seller, that is the participant, was selling crafts imported from several parts of the world, including the Amazon basin. And the issue of interest was the sale of hand-carved boxes, wooden boxes that had an inlay of semi-precious stones and metals. Now, the participants were told that comparable items were listed at prices ranging from $445 to $490 on other websites, and that a friend who worked at a local handicrafts emporium thought that the participant could sell this particular box to their own emporium for $335, but that they might possibly secure $40 to $50 more if they attempted to sell to other stores. The listing price of the wooden box was at $400, and we wanted to see if our participants would make different sized concessions to the opponent based on whether or not she was wearing heels. So here is a picture that was used for our flats condition and here for our heels condition. As you can see, everything is identical, but the counter offer, and we're looking at the first counter offer made to avoid any endogeneity effects, any confounds. Turns out that the heeled opponent got a higher counter offer of $389, which would be unfavorable to her as a buyer, whereas the individual wearing flats, she got a counter offer of $357. So there is some economic significance, as we can see in this particular study. But again, there might be certain issues with this study, right? Because these are undergraduate students, and undergrads, who knows what they're really thinking, right? So I decided to go ahead and conduct another study, and this time I focused on 102 executives from the healthcare, IT, and finance industries. And I was interested in seeing how would these executives who had signed up to attend a 4-hour executive development session on decision-making that involved interactions with the facilitator or the instructor and involved a lot of walking around activities and so forth, would they end up giving different evaluations for the instructor based on whether she was wearing heels or whether she was wearing flats, okay? So participants or the executives showed up and they took part in the 4-hour interactive session, and subsequently at the end of it, they ended up evaluating the instructor on a bunch of dimensions, including items such as the instructor was effective in conveying knowledge about the subject matter, the instructor was effective in stimulating new ways of thinking, and so on and so forth. And what I found was that when the instructor, it's the same person, mind you, same content, okay, when the instructor was wearing heels, then her appraisal was lower, about 5.21. And when she was wearing flats, her evaluation was significantly higher at about maybe 5.7 points. So this was very interesting that not only undergraduates, but execs also are responding similarly to women in heels versus flats. But there was a problem with this study. And the problem was I had to use block randomization, right? Because you have a bunch of people in one session, bunch in another. What if in some sessions where the appraisal was low, there was some unique, weird group dynamics that actually impacted the instructor evaluation? So to rule this out, I designed another study with tighter controls. And in this particular study, I recruited 220 senior managers from Qualtrics panels, where these individuals were told that they are they're asked to evaluate a videotaped interview of an individual that has applied for a job, the position of a marketing team lead at a company called Cadmium Inc. And participants were then shown a video of this candidate who had apparently taken part in that interview. So we had two conditions. In one condition, in the video, our hired artist ended up wearing flat shoes, and in the other one, she was wearing high-heeled shoes. In this interview, the participants could see her open a door, enter into the interview room and then respond to a bunch of questions such as, hey, why do you want to work for our company, Cadmium Inc.? The interviewer was male, controlled for that. And ask questions like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And subsequently, the participants were asked to evaluate the suitability of this particular individual for the role, the marketing team lead, which is, by the way, a gender neutral sort of a role, if there exists one. And also to assess her on her competence levels, warmth, whether she has high status, power, whether she's autonomous, and also her sexual attractiveness. Because I wanted to see if any of these constructs would work as mediators and explain the relationship between footwear or symbols of femininity, okay, and professionalism, and the subsequent appraisal of the individual. And as it turns out, candidate evaluations were significantly lower in the experimental condition, where that particular individual ended up being assessed as being weaker when she was wearing heels as opposed to flats. Okay, so once again, we're seeing some interesting pattern of results. We've got managers assessing this interview scenario, but I thought, wait a minute, this particular interview was for a marketing team lead, which is kind of lower middle level managerial position. In the media around this time, I was seeing all these execs, both in the tech sector, so Marissa Myers, and then you've got Sheryl Sandberg and others, who were featured on the front page of business magazines wearing heels. So I thought maybe things are different once you go up the corporate hierarchy. Maybe at higher status jobs, the heel effect doesn't work. So I went ahead and conducted another study. And in this particular study, recruited 300 working professionals. And these working professionals were asked to watch a videotaped MBA orientation featuring a female faculty director of an MBA program. Okay, and participants were told that because of COVID, we're having our orientation online. And here are some snippets. Can you evaluate this individual on their presentation abilities as well as leadership skills? And they ended up watching a video. In this particular video, the female faculty director, she either wore heels or she wore flat footwear. This time the color was not black. We went with navy blue. And I'm very grateful to Stephanie Peterson for being my model. She actually works for my business school and is phenomenal. And what we did was to once again ask them, okay, so not only the presentation skills of the MBA program, but also what about her warmth? Is she warm? Is she powerful? Is she high on status? Is she sexually attractive? And so forth. And what we found was that in this particular study, once again, when the female faculty director wore heels, her evaluation was lower at 6.03, whereas when she wore flats, her appraisals were higher at 6.23 points. And not only that, unlike the previous study, which I kind of breezed over quickly, turns out for the first time we saw that the sexual attractiveness, the perceived sexual attractiveness for the faculty director was higher in this particular study, where it's an older individual. I don't know if you caught it, by the way, but it is the same individual who was in the negotiation study. She was younger back then, she's older now, slightly different hair. But interestingly, she was this time perceived to be more sexually attractive in the heels condition. However, heeled footwear lowered perceptions of her power and competence. And in general, it hurt her appraisals, right? So even professional women might be appraised badly if they are viewed wearing heels, right? Now, I couldn't help but wonder that perhaps I had got it all wrong. Instead of looking at women higher up in the organization, maybe I should be looking at a different context that might change the heel effect somewhat. So I was curious to see if context mattered. In other words, would, in fact, having this person that's wearing heels either be in a masculine occupation or a feminine occupation make a difference in terms of how she is perceived, in terms of her leadership abilities and competence. So I did another study, this is the final study, where I manipulated the context, occupational context, based on whether it's masculine or feminine, and accordingly also higher or lower status to a certain extent. And more importantly, I also decided to take a look at what would happen if you just can't see the shoes of the person. Okay, how would wearing flats rank relative to no shoes? Would it be lower or higher evaluations? So I did what we in experimental psychology call a 3x2 factor study, a 3x2 design, where either the heels, the footwear were visible and were heels or flats, or there was no visual information, and manipulated the occupation as well, and recruited 450 MTurk workers who were about 42 years old to take part in the study, where they were told that, hey, there is this company called Flexon that has advertised for a position. And this is what the ad would look like for half the people. Those in the masculine occupation saw that the job title was technical manager. Technical is more masculine. And the annual salary was $185,000, so a little bit on the high side here, again, corresponding to masculine occupations. And the language of the advert was also gendered. So we said, we are looking for strong individuals who thrive in a competitive atmosphere. We're specifically interested in candidates who are assertive and ready to take on leadership roles. And the job description included responsibilities such as managing, directing, consulting, preparing budgets, and so on and so forth. In the feminine condition, okay, we said the job title was HR manager, which is stereotyped as being somewhat feminine. And the annual salary accordingly was lower at $55,000. And the language was also gendered, right? So it said, we're looking for community-oriented individuals who thrive in a cooperative atmosphere. We are specifically interested in candidates who are professional and courteous and ready to take on meaningful roles. And the job descriptions included managing the HR of the firm, reviewing and approving human resources, communicating with employees, preparing budgets, motivating employees to fund events, and so forth. Very feminine, okay? And we ended up manipulating the footwear by showing our MTurk participants either LinkedIn-like profiles with very generic information that could fit either a technical manager or an HR manager, but manipulating the footwear on the individual, making her wear heels or flat footwear, or simply not showing the feet, okay? And what we found was that in the experimental condition, in other words, when we had the woman wearing heels, if it was a feminine occupation like HR, then wearing flats did not necessarily give her an advantage. And by the same token, wearing heels also didn't do her much good compared to flats. So it's kind of like neutral. It's not having any kind of a significant impact. But in the masculine occupation condition, what we did find was, once again, in the flat footwear condition, well, this person is viewed as being more suitable for the job, the masculine job of tech manager, whereas in the heel condition, she's being evaluated even worse than the no footwear condition, right? So essentially, what I'm showing you over multiple studies is that it seems that women in heels tend to get disadvantaged, especially in masculine stereotyped occupations. And with that, I think I need to open the floor up for questions. But before I do so, I found it very endearing when last month M&M's got their little icons to switch up a bit, right? So they had the green M&M who used to wear heeled footwear, and now the green M&M is wearing sensible shoes. So I just thought I'd leave you with that visual for what it is worth. And I'm very happy to take questions as moderated by Professor Max Bazerman. Thank you so much.
Sreedhari, thank you. That's just spectacular. And thank you for this amazing overview. And there's so many pieces of your talk that I was completely unaware of. So I appreciate all I've learned. So we have a lot of people who I would read as academics who are providing questions and comments. And so I'm going to try to integrate across those. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of questions of people who are asking questions about the clarification of your studies. A lot in the first TED Talk study that you presented, people wanted to know, were your respondents American? Are they males and females? Was there a particular type of talk that these people were giving? So was it from a category of TED Talks? How did you code attractiveness? What do you mean by accent? Is that accent in comparison to having an American accent? So those are some of the questions. So any clarification, I think that we have people who would have been happy to hear 40 minutes on your TED Talk study alone. And there were so many other pieces that we got to hear about. So can you clarify any pieces that you think are particularly informative to us?
Yes, thank you. So Max, great questions. Thank you so much to the wonderful audience for asking them. The first study was actually a field study. In other words, I did not have any participants. TED Talks, to those of you who are unfamiliar with TED Talks, these are high-profile talks on technology, education, design, art, and more recently, inclusive of humanities. And TED Talks, the creator of TED Talks, they also host their talks on YouTube. And YouTube has this feature where you can like or dislike videos. More recently, I have noticed that YouTube has got now the ability to turn down the dislike feature so that you can, protect the sentiments of the presenters, I suppose. But at the time that I collected the data, I could get how many likes a certain video had got. So this is not experiment. These are not participants. This is real world data. What I'm doing is I'm looking at total views. How many views does a video have? How many likes does this particular video have? What was the duration of the video? Because shorter videos tend to be better. So I try to keep my talk short, and longer ones tend to not. So hopefully that clarifies that this was not some experiment that I did, rather this was sort of a field study. Number two, how did I go ahead and code for attractiveness? That's a great question. So my army of RAs coded all of these presenters on how attractive they are, how unattractive they are. Which was, and if it is helpful, because I'm an artist, symmetrical faces end up being perceived as attractive. So right now I've got 2 scars, very unattractive. Okay. And then additionally, you were asking me also to tell you about other coding parameters. So again, my RAs help tremendously. There are also software packages that can code emotions. So I did emotions in 2 different ways. One was with Face Reader, which is a software, not trying to promote them here, but they are wonderful. And they do give concessions to academics. So Face Reader is a very helpful software to code emotions. So the computer does it. It's an AI algorithm that basically codes. But I've also had humans code faces, because when a presenter is moving too much, the software fails. So human coders tend to be better. So that is how that particular study was conducted.
So lots of questions about generalizability to location and audience. And I was personally fascinated by your history from Persia to France to the US. But how does this notion of heels as a cultural statement get translated throughout the rest of the world? And to what extent do you see your studies in contemporary society as generalizing across different cultures? And obviously you can't have empirical answers to all of that, so we're asking you to speculate on some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Max. And once again, thank you to all the diverse people asking these lovely questions. And I realized that I didn't tell you about the accent. The accent was relative to the American accent. So American versus non-American. Okay, so how does it generalize to other cultures? And would it even generalize to other cultures? So I strongly suspect that yes, it might generalize to other cultures, some more so than others. So for example, in the introduction to my talk, I pointed out how there were movements, for instance, as far east as Japan, and also in the UK and other parts of the world. So for example, the Philippines and British Columbia, these are two places where the government has actually banned companies from requiring women to wear heels. So in other words, there's cultural awareness around this particular issue. Most of my studies were done here in the US, and most of the Confederates that I used were intentionally white females. You might have noticed that. I have follow-up studies where I'm looking at, for example, people with other skin tones and how individuals react. But I need to take into account the research on intersectionality, which looks at not only a woman's gender, but also her race or maybe her sexual orientation, and how then it translates into the heel effect. But to answer your question more candidly, if I had to speculate, I would expect that in France, and please don't take it the wrong way, but in France, there might be more tolerance, perhaps for heels. I don't know. I was recently looking at some French media outlets where women were portrayed in interesting ways. The article was supposedly about women receiving bonuses in the banking sector. And there was almost like a half nude picture of a woman. And I was like, what is going on here? So cultural sensitivity might vary, but I would conjecture that in a lot of cultures, you would find similar effects, because ultimately, heels are, like, in this global economy, we tend to have a shared sort of consensus about certain things like attire. So, for example, I worked in India, and I'm surprised to say this, but in several of my Indian companies, ones I've consulted with subsequently too, oftentimes formal outfits are considered to be Western formal. And so Western notions, including those related to high heels, might convey over to those cultures.
So thank you for that tour around the world. There's a variety of other questions having to do with those people that you've excluded, because you've been talking about females, and people want to know, what about males in lifts, which I assume is the male version of a heel? People who have non-binary self-identities in heels, and sort of another demographic question that is at least partially related is the age of the assessor. Is there a change going on in terms of the view of heels across age? Yeah. So male, non-binary, and age are the three things I brought up, but feel free to talk about any other demographics that you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll start empirically and then I'll go back into theory. So in this particular study, we had undergraduate students, so people in their early 20s, right? We had executives, we're talking about people in their 50s, and we're seeing the effect. So we're not necessarily seeing a different pattern of findings across different audiences. What I am seeing is that when the person who's wearing heels is a young person versus an older person, the older person is perhaps not being harmed as much. Maybe she's already established her credibility as a female professional. I don't know. But the age of the wearer seems to matter more than the age of the perceiver. Having said that, I'm still, I'm hopeful that the current generation is going to be different, especially my little boy. I hope he grows up to be different. In terms of what about the men? You've excluded the men. I expected someone to say that. So I haven't looked at men's footwear, but there are other people who have. So I believe Dan Ariely, Francesca Gino, and others have looked at the red sneaker effect, where men who conform to the norms versus men who break the norms. Seems that those who break the norms, those who wear red sneakers, seem to get a little bit of a boost in terms of evaluations or appraisals. But I have looked at men with ties and men without ties. And I found something similar to the red shoe effect, where men wearing ties are perceived to be okay for entry-level positions, but not so much for higher-level positions. And by the way, to my lovely audience, look what Max Bazerman is wearing. He's an HBS professor. He's not wearing a suit and a tie, right? He's casually dressed. So with older men, it seems to benefit them not to go the tie route. What about people who are non-binary or who identify as LGBTQ+. Well, I would like to request James Kerwin to invite me again to PON because I'm doing some research on that particular topic that's currently under revise and resubmit. But in the context of footwear, some of our TED talkers were publicly identified as being lesbians. So we controlled for that, but the percentage of lesbians in our sample was really small. So I cannot speak to that, but there is work that I'm doing currently in the context of negotiations that might be helpful to answer some of these questions.
Thank you. The other kind of, it's more of a trend rather than a demographic or individual difference issue, but many of our participants have noticed that we're on Zoom. And so other than the fact that you showed us your shoe, we don't see feet anymore.
Yeah.
And we've gotten used to that. And yet we're going to re-enter a new world where we're going to actually return to doing things in person, which we haven't done for the last 2 years. Do you have an assessment of how this 2 years on Zoom is going to affect the perception of heels or other modes of dress when we move back to our former work setting?
Okay, that is a wonderful question. And you're so right. I personally feel that Zoom world is not, I mean, it has its disadvantages, but right now I'm wearing a dress, but I have some really warm sort of pajamas underneath because I get cold easily, okay? And I'm not wearing makeup. Can you see that? I'm not, that's virtual makeup. I'm not wearing makeup, right? Zoom adds the makeup to my face. So the thought of going back to the workplace and having to, once again, adhere to the expectations of what professional attire is a little bit unattractive in some ways. But my hope is that especially with people having been in the Zoom world where they realize that a lot of business can be conducted perfectly, especially by women, without them having to wear heeled footwear or without them having to dress up and look a certain way. Hopefully it has been a bit of a social intervention created by nature, Mother Nature or Father Nature, to make us a little bit more aware. But at the same time, as an OB scholar, organizational behavior scholar, I also realize that sometimes strong situations can cause us to revert back to our old selves. So maybe once we are in physically, in the same building, maybe some of those old patterns of behaviors and expectations might resurface. So it's entirely possible that we may not be fully cured yet.
So the next question is kind of a combination of comments in chat and questions, but a lot of people have commented about their own experience in their own industry. One of the common industries that people are associated with at PON Talks is academia. But even within academia, there are big differences in norms between a business school versus the arts and sciences within a university. Can you talk about how some of your conclusions are affected by industry and whether there are kind of interesting reversals that you would predict? So certainly there are people who responded to pieces of your talk by saying, not in my industry. And certainly with the notion that, at times you were talking about the positive of heels and people were saying, people in my academic world would just not respond that way. So there was some kind of pushback based on moderating influences. So focusing on industry or social context of the work setting, can you talk about how you see that affecting some of your conclusions?
Yeah, so again, a great observation. So thank you for your comments and the pushback. This only helps to strengthen the research paper, which I'm writing. So I would say that, yeah, absolutely, the industry will matter, right? So for example, if you are working in a lab, okay, so a biochemical lab, the official dress code policy will be closed-toe shoes that are that are stable. So heels wouldn't, or sandals would not be, or flip-flops would not be allowed in those kind of environments. So the question almost becomes moot in such a situation. However, in other sectors like the tech sectors, if you look at my studies, the first study had an academic presenters, right, set of academic presenters, but then subsequently it was a business school student. That was the expectation in the negotiation study. And subsequently applying for a lower middle management job or an upper middle management job, and then, you know, a director and so forth. So there was some consistency there. However, when the gender of the occupation changed, the results were different. So HR jobs doesn't matter. Wear heels, wear flats, doesn't matter, except that, you know, there's a lot of research done by the podiatry people that shows that heels can really harm your feet and your calves and your knees. So, you know, just make sure you stretch, ladies, if you're wearing heels. Others were saying, not in my job. It might be the case that in your little subculture, things are different. Maybe you're more woke and more alert and aware about these gender dynamics. But so for example, I remember seeing a tweet a few years ago when somebody quite prominent in the tech space took a picture at a tech conference, a computer science conference, of an attendee who was wearing heels and made a comment, and the internet, Twitter, attacked this individual quite mercilessly. So, you know, so yeah, so that I would fully expect variations, but the important thing here is that across multiple sets of scenarios, we're still seeing an effect. So, you know, be cognizant that even small things like this can influence other people's perceptions of you as a professional and an individual.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate your flexibility in responding to questions for which it's not even reasonable for us to expect that you would have studies that would directly answer the question. So your extension of your empirical results to ideas that you have is enormously helpful to all of us. I want to, before turning it back to Nicole, I just want to highlight for you that the interest in your talk has been enormous. So I think I've asked 5 questions, there's 28 questions, and there's hundreds of comments in chat, a lot providing people's own personal experience with things that you were talking about throughout. So I think that you have kind of a ton of feedback waiting for you, which I'm sure that the PON team will make sure you get a copy of, and that you will find it helpful. A lot of people have lots of questions for other details of not only how you dress, but how I dress. And they want to know whether this is a status symbol or not, and things like that. My spouse would claim I'm not prone to actually spend money on clothing, so I wear what happens to come in the door, but that may be a self-serving comment on that. So with that, I want to thank you for bringing your work to us. It's great to see you return to the PON environment. Always great to see you in the broader Harvard environment. And with that, back to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Max.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sreedhari and Max, and how great this was. And yes, I didn't know that everyone's personal clothing choices were going to be analyzed today, but Sreedhari, you're probably used to that. So this was a really inspiring conversation. I wish we had polled our participants today on what their footwear choices were, and if they were going to change as an outset of your discussion. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who attended today. We always appreciate your energy. So many questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We really appreciate it. Please stay tuned with PON for our upcoming offerings. We have Zainab El Bernouisi on February 24th, and then a whole slate of one-day programs, 3-day intensives, some online, some in person. And when we get back, James and I will be wearing red sneakers for our first in-person experience, thanks to Sreedhari's great advice and research. Thanks to all of you. We look forward to seeing you soon at PON. Have a great rest of your day, evening, morning. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you.